Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is James Monroe, Part 1. James Monroe was the fifth President of the United States. And in my opinion, we were 5 for 5 as a country. In other words, the first 5 presidents were outstanding. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. The interesting thing is that Washington was a great military leader, but the next 3 fellows, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, none of them served in the Revolution militarily. They served politically. But James Monroe, the fifth, was also a soldier in the war, saw a lot of action. So he had that in common with George Washington. Both men were men of action, not so much intellectuals. They called James Monroe Jim. The capital of Liberia in West Africa the name is Monrovia, and it's named after James Monroe because he played a major role in the founding of the country of Liberia. Interesting. The Monroe Doctrine comes from James Monroe. This idea that was American policy that North and South America were off limits for further European colonization. In other words, that the Americas were a part of the sphere of influence of the United States. The famous painting by Emanuel Lutz called Crossing of the Delaware, some people call it Washington Crossing the Delaware, depicts George Washington before the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey. Actually, in that painting, James Monroe is also depicted. He's in the back behind Washington, holding the American flag. The motto of James Monroe's presidency was the era of good feelings, because the Federal, at least early on, the Federalist Party died. We only had one political party for a period of time, and there was people after the War of 1812. People were pretty happy. There was a sense of unity in the United States. And I like to use that. Quote whenever I'm having a nice friendship with someone and we're getting along real well, and I'll say to quote the motto of James Monroe administration, may the era of good feelings continue. James Monroe was the last president who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was the last to wear a powdered wig, knee breeches, and a tricorn hat. He played a major role in the War of 1812 during the dark days in 1814 after Washington City was burned and our country things were looking pretty bad for our country. As governor of Virginia, James Monroe played a major role in promoting public schools and the infrastructure, which did a lot for his state and for the country, because those things are important functions of government. He also was involved in creating security in what was back then the West, the land just east of the Mississippi River, places like Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Tennessee, and so forth. And he was involved in making that land secure from Indian attacks, and which meant that settlers could move in, and they poured into those areas. During the Revolution, James Monroe saw a lot of action. He was in many battles, including New York City, Trenton, Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth Courthouse. James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. So he was among the first 5 presidents. He was the 4th of 5 to be from Virginia. He was the second oldest of 5 children. His parents were Spence and Elizabeth Jones Monroe. Now, when he was 11 years old in 1769, and he started going to school in Westmoreland County's only school the teacher was Reverend Archibald Campbell from Scotland. Apparently, there were a lot of fine teachers from Scotland. I believe Jefferson and Madison also had Scottish teachers. So at this school, one of his schoolmates was John Marshall, and they became lifelong friends. Of course, John Marshall became the Supreme Court Chief Justice. It was a 5-mile walk every day for James Monroe to school and home. He would go to school with books under one arm and a musket over his shoulder, because there was a danger of Indian attacks, and he also was would be, would be hunting, going to school and coming home, and he was a good shot, which helped him later, when it was he faced situations which might have involved a duel, because people didn't want to get involved in a duel with Monroe because he was a good shot. It was said that his mother, quote, never lacked squirrels for a stew or pigeons for a pie. So the good old days when we had squirrel stew and pigeon pie. In 1772, James Monroe was 14 and his mother died. Yeah, so he lost his mom at a very young age, and she had complications after the birth of her youngest child. 2 years later, Monroe's father died. So he was at age 16, both of his parents were gone. And for a time, he was in charge of the 500-acre farm, but he was really too young. And his maternal uncle, the brother of his mother, Joseph Jones, stepped in and helped James and his siblings until they reached adulthood. So he became like a parent to them, a father. So he did a good job. Joseph Jones really helped Monroe and his siblings. In 1774, James Monroe started college, and he was a student at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And again, John Marshall was a fellow classmate there. And so this was really something. It was a year before the American Revolution started, and Williamsburg was an important place because Virginia played a very important role in the Revolution. And Williamsburg was the capital of Virginia. So, and the House of Burgesses would meet there from April to October. And during those times, there was plenty of pomp and ceremony, dances at the Apollo Room and at the Raleigh Tavern, and famous people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Patrick Henry would come to the House of Burgesses. And Monroe was a student during, and he'd see these famous men who became even more famous in the years to come. In 1775, the American Revolution started, and up in Boston. There was no fighting in the South yet, but Monroe and his fellow college students began daily drills on the college green, preparing for war. And this was on the verge of the American Revolution. Governor Dunmore at one point got scared, the British governor, and he fled to a British naval frigate just before James Monroe and 24 militiamen stormed the governor's palace and seized 200 muskets and 300 swords. So James Monroe fought in the American Revolution for 4 years, from 1776 to 1780, and he was at the critical Battle of Trenton in December of 1776. He became a lieutenant colonel, not really a high-ranking officer. He quit college. He did not finish college. I don't believe he finished college because later on he went on to have a legal career. And back then you didn't have to have a college degree to become a lawyer. You just had to study and pass the bar exam. So he was involved in the early in his military career. He was fighting in New York City, the battles of Harlem and White Plains. In January of 76, the British had burned Norfolk, Virginia, which was a very terrible thing. And this was in the middle of winter, and a lot of the people became homeless. And Monroe's brother Spence had recently died. So this is when he decided to drop out of college, and he enlisted in the Virginia militia. And by August, James Monroe and the Virginia militia, they traveled north to New York City and were involved in the fighting against the British in New York City, in Manhattan. And earlier in the year, the British had withdrawn from Boston. And then New York City became the theater of war in the late summer of 1776, shortly after the Declaration of Independence. And New York City was a major defeat for the United States, and it was lost. A lot of guys died, a lot of weapons were lost, a lot of prisoners were taken. But James Monroe was with the American Army as it retreated from New York City across New Jersey to the Delaware River and into Pennsylvania. And he wrote about that time, the retreat. It was a very depressing time. A lot of people thought the war was lost, the war was over, because the army melted away, and it had gone from like 12,000 guys to 3,000. And losing New York City was very traumatic. Anyway, he wrote about the retreat across New York City in the fall of 1776. Quote, "It will be forever celebrated in the annals of our country for the patient suffering, the unshaken firmness and gallantry of this small band, and the great and good qualities of its commander. General Washington was always near the enemy, and his countenance and manner made an impression on me, which time can never efface. A deportment so firm, so dignified, so exalted, but yet so modest and composed, I have never seen in any other person." So he was Monroe was one of the guys who didn't go home, who didn't give up, who didn't desert, and he was with Washington during these very dark times. And of course, in December 1776, George Washington knew he was the commander of the American Army. He knew he had to do something. Something had to happen. They needed a victory because the morale was extremely low, and it was so low that people thought the war was over. We had lost the War of Independence. And so he planned the battle to attack Trenton, New Jersey. And this is where that's why the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware is so important. And this was a major victory that the American Army marched all night. They recrossed the Delaware River into New Jersey, attacked Trenton at dawn. And Trenton was full of British soldiers who were actually German mercenaries fighting for the British, these Hessian soldiers. And there was some fighting. It wasn't a long battle because they were sort of taken by surprise, and these guys were screaming when they entered. The thing is, Monroe himself was shot, and he was severely wounded. An artery was severed, and he could have bled to death. He almost died at Trenton. And his life was saved by a quick-thinking doctor who stopped the bleeding. A bullet had torn through his chest and lodged in his shoulder. And what followed, he needed 10 weeks to recover from this wound. Now back to the before the battle, this painting, Washington crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Lutz, depicts the recrossing of the Delaware before the battle. And in this painting, Monroe is depicted as holding the American flag behind George Washington. It's an idealized painting. Actually, Monroe is in a different boat, but it's still I still like the painting, even if it isn't historically accurate. So after that, he had to recover from this wound, and then after he recovered, James Monroe became an aide-de-camp for Brigadier General Lord Stirling. He saw action at the Battle of Brandywine, which was another American defeat. And at that battle, the Marquis de Lafayette was wounded. He was this famous French volunteer who came to serve in the American Army. And around this time, Monroe and Lafayette became friends. They became lifelong friends. And Monroe tended Lafayette's wounds. Lafayette was wounded, and Monroe stayed up all night helping him and nursing him. And they had a wonderful lifelong friendship. And as a result, James Monroe became very pro-French. He was very much in favor of France, believed in that France was a good country. And the two superpowers were Great Britain and France, and everyone had, of course, we were fighting the war against Great Britain, so it was natural, and the French were helping us. But he maintained that pro-French attitude for the rest of his life. During the very tough, severe winter in 1777, 1778 at Valley Forge, and again, hard times for the Continental Army, James Monroe was there. And when so many of the fellows starved and froze to death at Valley Forge, he shared a cabin with John Marshall, again his old friend from childhood, who became famous as Supreme Court Chief Justice. And before that, he was also fought at the Battle of Germantown, and then at the tremendous victory of Monmouth Courthouse in the spring of 1778. So By 1780, Monroe had withdrawn, had left service. His military career was over, and he kept trying to find hoping to become an officer, become a general, and I wasn't able to do so. But he definitely had extensive military action. The war was almost over. By 1780, he began studying law under Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson. Very interesting. Thomas Jefferson became like his law professor, and they became very good friends. Historian Harry Ammon wrote, quote, "Jefferson, like all Monroe's friends, cherished him for the tremendous warmth of his personality, his innate goodness, and his ready response to the feelings of others." So they had a wonderful friendship, James Monroe and Thomas Jefferson. By 1782, the war was over. We'd become independence had been won, although we were not one country yet. The Constitution had not been created. But Monroe was elected to the Virginia legislature, so this was the beginning of his political career. He was a protege, again, of Thomas Jefferson. Soldiering had built his confidence. This really helped him a lot. He'd been through a lot in the war, these 5 major battles, and he was not brilliant at speaking, but he was a good listener. That's a very important quality. He smiled a lot, and he wrote warm, sincere letters. He's a good guy. James Monroe, really good guy. And that's the most important thing, his character. And he had that. He was a good man. By 1783, James Monroe was a member of the Virginia's delegation to Congress. Now, this is, again, before we had the U.S. Constitution. So that was the Confederation Congress at that time meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. The summer of 1783, Monroe spent at Monticello with Thomas Jefferson. He spent the whole summer there, and Jefferson became like a father to him. They had a wonderful friendship. It was very nice. However, in 1785, Thomas Jefferson was sent to France as U.S. ambassador, and James Monroe was distraught because Jefferson had become his best friend, his mentor, his brother, and again, he was a father to him. And they had been inseparable for months. They were together all the time. So this is really tough, Jefferson leaving. And Monroe wrote a letter to Jefferson, and he wrote this, quote, "I very sensibly feel your absence, not only in the solitary situation in which you have left me, but upon many other accounts. I shall write you constantly." And so this is tough when Jefferson went to France. James Monroe was quiet, but he made friends all over the country. He was curious, courteous, open, humble, generous. He was good at making and keeping friends. Good guy, really good guy. That's the thing that's very appealing. And this was the secret of his success. It's not very complicated if be a good person. In 1786, James Monroe married Elizabeth Cartwright, whom he had met in New York City. She was from New York City. They established a home which they named Ashlawn near Monticello. In their married life, they had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son that died at age 2. His wife Elizabeth they had a very good marriage. She was beautiful, well-educated, artistic, and musical. She was also political. She was a smart lady, and she was a big help to him in his political career and in his personal life. They had a very, very wonderful relationship, and she was a real partner. She was kind of like John Adams' wife Abigail, and she didn't have Dolly Madison's personality, but she was a very strong person and very smart. A lot of women back then weren't into politics. They thought, oh, this is men's business. But Elizabeth Monroe was very interested in politics, and she was very helpful. They had a wonderful relationship, wonderful marriage. When they got married, Monroe was 28, and Elizabeth, whom he called Eliza, was 18. They got married in New York City at Trinity Episcopal Church on Broadway and Wall Street. So he embarked on married life. By 1786, for the following 4 years, Monroe was a member of the Virginia legislature, and the couple, James and Elizabeth, moved from New York City to Virginia and had their home in Fredericksburg. Of course, they also had this country home, Ashlawn. Now, when the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, Monroe was not a part of it, and then during the ratification process, he was against it, and because there was a lot of opposition in Virginia, and he was swayed by that, so he actually voted against ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788. Although it did pass, and then of course he became president himself. During this time, he was working as a lawyer, traveling the circuit in Virginia to places like Richmond, Charlottesville, and Staunton, and home to Fredericksburg. And during this time, he very much missed his wife and their baby Eliza. So they actually he called his wife Eliza, and then they had a daughter. They named their oldest daughter. They named Eliza as well. So that must have been a little bit confusing. So even though he had been against the U.S. Constitution, by 1790, he was elected a senator from Virginia, and he served for the next 4 years through the influence of Patrick Henry. Now, he had more than one, and he became a leader in the Republican Party. This was the beginning of partisan politics in the United States, and he became a leader. He was was in conflict with Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Party leader, and they twice they almost had duels. So of course Alexander Hamilton was kind of a difficult guy, so that was not uncommon. He was in conflict with a lot of people, actually. By 1794, James Monroe was appointed U.S. ambassador to France, and he was there for 2 years, and this was really something. During his time in France, he helped secure the release of Thomas Paine, who had been imprisoned. Now remember, France was going through the French Revolution, and a lot of crazy stuff was going on. A lot of bad things were happening. And Thomas Paine Thomas Paine was from Great Britain, and then he'd come to the U.S., and he played a major role in the American Revolution. He'd written the book Common Sense, which helped change public opinion to supporting a war of independence. And then during the dark days in late 1776, he wrote another short book called The Crisis, which helped raise morale in the American Army, when he wrote the words, "These are the times that try men's souls." And then later he had gone to France, and he'd been elected to the French legislature, the Assembly, even though he wasn't French, but the French Revolution was kind of crazy. But and then Monroe we're getting ahead of the story. Monroe was appointed because he was very much in favor of the French Revolution. He was appointed by President George Washington, and of course later he was recalled because it was believed that he was overly French, and he was a victim of the political conflict between Great Britain and France. Now, Elizabeth, his wife, was very, very happy to go to Paris because, it was the glamorous city. It still is, Didn't have the Eiffel Tower yet, but it was still, considered, for Americans, considered a very, glamorous, exotic city. So, on June 18th, 1794, James Monroe, his wife Elizabeth, and their 8-year-old daughter Eliza sailed from Baltimore to Le Havre, France, a 29-day trip. And they arrived during the Reign of Terror in France. Boy, tough situation that they ended up being in. 500,000 French citizens were in prison for political reasons, even though they really were innocent. It was just crazy what they were doing, and they were awaiting death. 17,000 had already had their heads cut off by the guillotine. 25,000 were murdered by mobs, and the architect of the Reign of Terror, fortunately, Robespierre recently himself had his head cut off, so it was near the end of the Reign of Terror. And the Monroe family, James and his wife and daughter, they arrived unwittingly in this scene of disaster. And it was kind of tough because he was very much he's pro-France and in favor of the French Revolution, and then he was in this very tough situation. He was very forceful. He was very forceful but friendly. He was very effective, actually, during this time because, he learned French, he was fluent in French, and the French liked him. He tried to end the French seizure of American ships. The French were agreeable. And this was a very tough time because Great Britain and France were at war, and these two superpowers, and the United States was trying to navigate between them and trying to avoid war with both of them. And then James Monroe was the U.S. ambassador in France during the Reign of Terror. Wow, talk about a tough situation. And also, he was able to get Americans released from French prisons. American citizens who had been there. It had become really lawless and insane. There was just this bloodlust from the poor against the rich, and no one was safe in France. And Americans had been arrested. He was able to get them released as U.S. ambassador. The citizens of Paris, the Parisians, were captivated by the beauty, elegance, and poise of Elizabeth, and she was dubbed, quote, La Belle Américaine. So that was, she was, they really thought she was something. And she was really strong-spirited. She learned French as well, and, she dressed well, and she was a real smart lady. Now, the other thing that happened is Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, he had gotten in trouble with the French Revolution. He was actually in the French Assembly, and then it wasn't safe for him. Things got so crazy, so he was going to be arrested. So he went into exile. And then since France was at war with all these different countries, he ended up being arrested by the Austrians. And he was in a prison in Austria during this very tough time. Meanwhile, his wife, Adrienne, back in Paris, she had been arrested and was in prison in Paris. So very, very tough. And actually, shortly before the Monroes arrived, her mother and grandmother had been beheaded. They had had their heads cut off by the guillotine in the Reign of Terror. And remember, Monroe and Lafayette had been very good friends. So here his good friend's wife was in prison. So they decided what can we do? And Monroe felt, well, as ambassador, he couldn't, shouldn't intervene directly. So Elizabeth said, well, I'll go. I'll see what I can do to help her get out of prison. So they had purchased a very nice carriage, and so Elizabeth Monroe, she got in that carriage and just went to this prison, the Plessis prison, where Madame Lafayette was. And Elizabeth Monroe braved the Parisian mob. So this was a dangerous situation. And the thing is, and Adrienne was released. Mrs. Lafayette's wife was released. So it was amazing and really, really something. And Elizabeth Monroe showed her courage, because this was a dangerous situation, and she was brave. And so Monroe was very happy that he was able to help his very good friend to get his wife released and save her life, because otherwise she would have been executed. She was going to have her head cut off by the guillotine in the Reign of Terror. During his time in France, Monroe purchased 30 volumes of Voltaire. So he was also an intellectual. 33 volumes of Rousseau and 15 volumes of Plutarch. Really good. Elizabeth bought a lot of furniture, which had formerly been the property of King Louis XIV and King Louis XV. Very, very interesting. So it appears we're out of time. We're going to continue next time. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.